monts et merveilles, vents et marées, au loin déjà la mer s'est retirée.
Good evening, my name is Joel Landy and you're watching Songs of Freedom. Songs of Freedom is a show that celebrates the dignity of human struggle, its many faces and its many voices. Sometimes those voices come from artists. Today is one of those days. Now, in the past, we usually have musical artists, but this is somebody who's an artist of painting, and, well, I'm going to let her tell her story. Her name is Helen. Levin, welcome to Songs of Freedom. We are right now at the Staten Island Museum, where Helen has an installation which is not only hers, but is also of her son. You don't get to see that too often.
Yes.
I'm going to read something to you, and I'm going to ask you, what does he mean by that? And then I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about your work.
Very good.
Okay, this is from a magazine called Gallery and Studio, and the gentleman who wrote this, his name is Ed McCormick, and Helen, Levin, and Golan.
Yes.
Okay, Levin closed the aesthetic generation gap at the Staten Island Museum. An intergenerational joint museum survey is a rare enough event, but rarer still is one in which the two artists represent such opposite poles of expression as do Helen, Levin, and her son Golan. Levin in their two-artist exhibition, The Gesture in Paint and Software at the Staten Island Museum. Helen Levin carries on the painterly tradition of the New York School in her large, abstract style paintings, while Golan Levin creates interactive software projects generated with digital motion capture techniques. And it goes on from there. So, what am I talking about? Talk a little bit about this and stuff. Before we do that, though, tell me a little bit about your background. How did you become an artist?
I always was an artist since I was a child. I used to love to draw faces, and then I majored in art and got a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Painting. And I decided after that I needed to continue because I didn't feel I had a real direction, even though I was committed to painting. And so I went to Columbia and I did the MFA program in painting, and I felt after that I had a sense of who I was and which direction in painting that I would go. That goes back a long way. I've been making art for about 60 years at this point.
Wow. Wow, you hold it well. You also were a teacher.
Yes.
So that paid the bills for a number of years while you were painting.
And helped support my family, young family, bringing up my son, Golan, who became an artist. And he's internationally known. And he's a new media artist. He's developed his own software, creative software, for both auditory and visual experiences. He's interested in interaction and abstraction, as my work is abstract, it turns out. He understands abstraction.
That's so you have a lot to be proud of there.
Thank you.
Okay, I wrote down some questions for this, and I also asked Helen to come up with a couple of questions that I would want her, she would want me to ask her. But talk about the installation itself.
Well, I have a group of paintings that were inspired, done within the last 10 years. They were inspired by something as simple as a small photograph to just start painting. And then I like spontaneity in my work, but it's very disciplined. And I'm influenced by the writings of Piet Mondrian, the Dutch artist and aesthetician. And he said that in his writings that art no longer had to paint a picture of anything, but that it was art itself that was, in quotes, the medium. As McLuhan said, the medium is the message. And so we sense an experience by looking at abstract painting. And I was very deeply interested in that.
I really like the colors that you use. You use a lot of vibrant colors. Talk about the colors that you use and why you choose them.
I'm interested in vibrant colors. One of the cornerstones of my work, beside the gesture, is a sense of composition. And if someone asks me if work is good or not, I would say that the composition is a satisfactory resolution of pictorial forces. That's color, that's light and dark, that's line, that's space. And if it results in I would say, say, intriguing way, then it helps to create a good work of art.
Do you go into a painting saying, okay, I want to evoke this feeling? Or do you have a vague idea of what you want to do and it ends up someplace else?
Absolutely.
Songwriting is like that.
Absolutely. What's that?
Songwriting. I noticed that in my songwriting, I might say, okay, this is what I want to write about. But the more powerful statements in the song are taking me someplace else. And it might be completely different. And it's like, oh, that is what I really wanted to say.
Oh, wonderful.
And that's, you know, instead of skating on the surface of a conversation, I get to the root of it.
Yes.
And that becomes the core of what the song is and where it goes.
Well, that's very true about my paintings because it's revealing my unconscious. And I'm happy to say that it quite serendipitously, the work tends to be upbeat. On the other hand, when I do occasional writings, they're not. So this reflects a deep sense of myself. And as you do your songs, when I paint, I also find the resolution reveals who I am. So it reveals the unconscious because gesture encompasses more than language. It encompasses the whole unspoken, subtle things that we do with our hands, our face, and deeply within ourselves. They express our insides, and it's self-revelatory, just like you said. You find out who you are, and that's poetry.
Yeah. And that's, so let's talk a little bit about art. I ask you, what is art? And why is it important? This is coming from an artist.
Well, I was also a mother and a citizen and a person in the world, and I see that people need to express themselves in art. They want to embellish their lives with beauty, and children need to have an outlet for their emotions. And in each society, it develops codified ways of presenting and having art. For example, in African culture, it was an artistic endeavor to embellish or to develop an aesthetic sensibility within a sculpture that had meaning in terms of ceremonies and rites and rituals, and that was, in essence, their art. And we respect that, and that's what you will see as different cultures have their own art forms, and they're all constantly evolving. In my son's case, as a new media artist, he takes the material, which is essentially my work is part of the material world, paintings on a wall, and he makes them into abstraction, not even material. They're experiences that are not material in the same sense.
It's an interactive display where people actually become part of the work as they're moving. You're going to be seeing some of that a little bit later on in the show.
And that work continues the gesture in a different sense. It's time-based art. It's electronic, and in his case, he chose to have interactive, direct response, real-time experiences for the public.
Now, on the wall here, as part of this installation, there are quotes. One of them says, "Spontaneous gesture is the spiritual source of all art." What does that mean, and why is gesture important?
Well, I took that from the writings of Albert Cazenet. His pseudonym was Jean Dudine, and he wrote in French, l'art et le geste. And in this story, in this text, aesthetics basically, he says that all arts, meaning everything we do, is basically gesture. And Cazenet also appreciated the fact that we need to perceive gesture and art in ordinary things. He said nature and the beauty and even the sunset or the storms, they're all expressive in a sense. And we should apply metaphors, and we should appreciate, and we should be inspired by this. And this develops our sensibility and our intelligence, because the brain, I don't need to be academic, but the brain does have certain areas that do receive and act as receptors for this very subtle world around us, world of gesture.
So that leads me to my next question. This is something we talked about before. As an artist, how do you know your picture is good? And as a person coming to a museum or looking at art, how do we know it's good?
That's a great question, and it of course has a subjective feeling about it in terms of people's response. But for myself personally, I require that my is resolved when I can basically, in my specific way that I require that my work be successfully resolved, is that if I take the picture and I translate it into black and white, in other words, into its what we call values. If I take any picture you see on the wall and transform it into black and white in photography or through the computer, I feel resolves, then I know the structure of the painting works. And that has been discovered over 100 years ago. For example, with photography and the development of that. In the 19th century, artists began to realize at the end of the century that what made art great throughout all the centuries before that was this structural quality and the abstract qualities that were right in the work itself. It could be a serpentine line, it could be beautiful shadows, it could be just the spatial relations that were developed, not necessarily the beauty of the lady or the gentleman who was painted, but the whole composition. And that's where composition, in terms of pictorial space two-dimensionally, that's my field, I try very hard to succeed in.
Yeah, so part of what I get here is that if you call yourself an abstractionist, it's like anything. You got to really know the rules and the structure before you start bending things. You can't just come into it and say, well, I'm going to do as I feel and it's going to be looking good. So can people possibly create good art without that kind of knowledge?
Well, it's not quite, as I see it, quite like that, in the sense that the knowledge is so open-ended, and each work of art is so unique that when you talk about bending the rules, that is true. I think each artist is bending the rules, and has to depend some degree on their, we use the word intelligence, sensitivity, and it is dependent on one more thing I think is helpful to help develop an aesthetic sensibility, know what's good, is to look at a lot of art, look at a lot of good art. That seems to be very helpful.
So where does one look to educate themselves about art?
Well, I remember
It could be a little intimidating. I want to estimate that most people watching this show tonight have never gone to art school, and might be a little intimidated or backed up by all the things that they're supposed to know about art, but it doesn't necessarily come from there. So what would you like people to know, or how would you like people to think when they're looking at your work? How would you like people to approach your work?
Well, I'd like them to think of themselves as a receptor of the experience of the art that they see, and to appreciate that, to appreciate the communication that is within the structure of the art, that is in the gestures, in the paint, and in the composition.
You mentioned gesture a lot. What does that really mean?
Well, the dictionary will talk about gesture as emotion. Can be, in some cases, I saw on Wikipedia it said even the eyes and the hands. So when one raises an eyebrow, there's a gesture.
It's a response to stimuli.
Yes, but some gestures are codified and they're called not spontaneous, but they're called symbolic. Like we cross our fingers, or we do specific gestures like this.
So it's a language of response.
Yes, it's very open-ended because with each person, the whole body language is unique. So I hope each painting is unique. And I think the stimulating people to see that is a very helpful thing, and I often would even say that I wish that our political leaders had experiences in drawing, because as a school teacher, and this is my own way of looking at things, I saw how as some students had the experience of drawing, in particular drawing gesturally and freehand, that they developed their intelligence. It turns out, of course, we know that the right brain deals with spatial intelligence and musical intelligence. And so there's something to developing the mind in this way. Don't you think so?
Well, coming from that background and point of view, I absolutely think so. I was going to ask you, you're an artist, you've been a teacher in the New York City school system, and now you're free to do with what you want. How important are art programs in school, and what How do you feel when you hear that art is the first thing cut when there are budget cuts to be made?
Terrible. And, even teachers themselves do not get a chance as in college or in university to have enough experience with creative drawing. And then they may become critics or they may become any number of things without really developing a sensibility that drawing and art will give them, and music. Don't you, as a musician, I'm sure you can appreciate that.
Oh yeah, yeah. It all gets back to listening.
Yes.
And being open to what happens after you're listening open.
Do you feel that music will help enhance your child's education?
Well, my daughter just entered preschool, and it costs a little more to pay for the art and the music, and I want to be the person who does that. I want to be the person who does that.
Why do you do that?
Because there's something in here that says that's important, and it's fulfillment, it's creativity, it's the expression of creativity equals happiness and
Freedom.
Freedom.
Yes.
This is Songs of Freedom, of course. That's what it's about.
So I think this conversation has helped develop a concurrence of ideas in the value of art. And I see that my son, in his case, is developing and taking it to another level, which I would love to be able to do myself, and I admire, and I'm happy that it is coming into the 20th century. I say this because so many artists and so many people in the public have said, what's this new media, and what does it have to do with art, which I love. But now we can see in this one little exhibition just one example of how art is part of a continuum. It's part of a dialogue, in my case, the paintbrush and the computer.
Yes. Well, let's take a look at Golan's work, okay? This is Songs of Freedom. I'm Joel Landy, and this is Helen Levin. And we're going to take a look at Golan Levin's work right now. So, Helen, what are we looking at right now?
These are images taken from people who are viewers of this museum exhibition. For example, if I go over here and I make a motion like this, it's captured by motion, and it stays into the computer.
I see. All right, so okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go dancing. I'm just going to go put my hands over my head and turn around. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our mind. Hey, so that is Songs of Freedom coming at you in a digital shape and form.
Yes, it's right there, Joel.
So you're saying people coming to this museum they become artistic figures.
Yeah, they're part of the history of the museum now. They're part of the history of
that's very wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, Helen, what's this one about? This is an iPad?
Yes, it says, using your finger, gently draw on the iPad screen, draw to begin, and you create this. And it repeats, and it's sort of generative, and it keeps developing whatever you create. And it's unique with each person.
What do you think of iPads? Are they another creative tool? There are thousands of apps now, and a number of them do things like this.
Oh, I bet. I'm not familiar with all of those, but...
many of them are musical and artistic at once.
What's nice about this is it's unique for each person, and it involves the gestures of the hand, and it's good for all ages to see the potential of their own creative capacity translated into an image. This one here is called Yellowtail, and this one says draw and begin, and using your finger gently draw on the iPad screen also. Now this is particularly fun because the images create like a mesh, and if you use and they keep moving on their own, and if you put your hand hold all the fingers there, then it creates an image with all the fingers. And it keeps moving, and
everybody's hands are a little bit different.
Well, everybody's images that they create are different, and you can do just all these various things with this.
Using your fingers.
There's the gesture.
Yes, we talked about gesture.
Yeah. Well, here's another one here called dendron. Now this is what's typically of generative because it keeps evolving into a way which is unpredictable. It's open-ended. One doesn't really know how it will end. But it does fill up the whole screen. But the configuration is unique for each person.
Let's take a look.
Sure. Dendron is similar to a growth in nature.
It's like a tree growing. And there it is.
Yeah. So that's all four of these. And this is for Flockus. And let's see if we can clear this screen on this.
So there's a lot of interactive games and toys to play with here at the installation.
Yes, and it should inspire people to go further with this kind of idea, hopefully.
All right, now I'm going to ask you this because you're an artist and you're sitting in front. With all this lovely work and all the things that you've done, how would you like to be? Artists are remembered, you know, as long as their work is, which is years and years and years and years into the future. How do you want to be remembered?
I want to be remembered as a bright light in people's lives.
Okay, could you elaborate on that?
Well, what I did was still talk to people. It would be exciting for them to look at, for them to make them happy, to be an inspiration for their own work. And that's about it.
That's great. Well, that's a lot. A couple of terms that one thing that I'm unclear about is this word formalist.
Yeah.
Why does that apply to you?
Why does it use that word? Because so many directions have occurred in visual art. I was part of the feminist movement, but I didn't take on the iconography is the correct term, that many feminists went into that direction, a certain different subject matter. It's often the body, actually. There were other movements, postmodern. I participated in performance art sometimes and other things, but I didn't find it as satisfying as doing the concrete formalist, basically. I'm concerned with aesthetics and form. I want my paintings to evolve from their pictorial language of line, color, and that pictorial language having to do with two-dimensional art on a picture plane is to me the most important thing.
So that makes you a formalist.
Well, yes, and I can express myself infinitely in this language.
What I find interesting here is that, and I guess you would consider yourself an abstract painter.
Oh, definitely.
So I tend to, and maybe this is my limited knowledge, but I think of abstract painters beyond the realm of labels. And formalist sounds so label limited, you know?
Oh, I see. Well,
But that's only my mind, and
yes.
that's the way words work.
Well, I think it's good. I think it's good because you have a broader view than most people. And so when I'm defining myself in formalist terms, so people don't think of me in terms of a political agenda in my work. I've been very often motivated. I remember Basiotis used to say, the professor I studied with, the famous painter William Basiotis, used to say, and I agree with that, and still do your politics, but keep your art separate from it. And that time, and so I sign petitions and I'm interested in politics, but I find that the dictum that tells me to make your art from your politics, not the language at this time in my life that I relate to in my art.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's no avoiding that some art is purely driven by politics or what the person is thinking. But I think of it in terms of Guernica, for instance.
Oh.
You know, Picasso's painting.
Oh, Guernica, sure.
Yeah, I mean, that was a very powerful statement. It was a strong political statement.
Sure.
But art does not have to be that way. I think of it in terms of music. You know, Paul McCartney writes silly love songs, and he writes that's part of what he does. Lennon was more into the political aspect of things. Doesn't make one's work better than the other.
But interestingly enough, Picasso did work on very formalist terms. He was interested in geometricizing, if that's the right, making geometric the shapes of animals and people. He was very much a formalist. He was very involved with the dynamics of the pictorial space, picture plane, in making this thing. He never became didactic or narrative. It's still a painting of forces, and he expressed that with dark and light in grays to show the color of his mood.
Talk about some of the other artists that you liked or were inspired by. You mentioned Kandinsky.
Oh, yes.
What was it about his work?
Well, I think the early work of Kandinsky particularly showed the freedom and the use of color in pictorial space that I thought was stunning, and his paintings still resonate with me. And I also love de Kooning, because I felt he was very expressive, and he took simple subject matter, just a portrait of a woman, and he expressed an enormous amount of violent emotion, which was his gestalt and his deep feeling about things. And other artists will use subject matter and express themselves. For example, I loved Arshile Gorky because of the exquisite surfaces and the exquisite, you could see his beautiful attitude toward shapes and colors that was sensual and marvelous and so deeply expressive of the angst that this man went through in the latter part of his life. And so I'm very moved by these paintings, and they're abstract.
Let's come to the end of this interview by talking just a little bit more about the installation here. Is there anything that you want people to know about this installation? It is running here at the Staten Island Museum until when?
January 8th, 2012.
So if you can come down here and take a look at it, you get right off the ferry and you're looking at the sign that says that's right across the street.
Yes.
So Helen, what direction is your art form taking you now as you move forward?
I'm interested very much in architectural space. It can be interior space. I was very impressed with various new contemporary architecture, how space is so compositionally organized, and it translates well in photographs in some cases, and it can be a wonderful source of inspiration for the spatial convolutions and things that really make for an interesting painting. And so I'm inspired by that.
Helen, thank you for coming to Songs for Freedom. And stay tuned for more interesting work in the world of art in whatever form or shape.
Thank you so much.
Au loin des
Bye-bye.